Join Catherine on her voyage to her property, where the enigmatic gardener David alters everything when he arrives. When the light shines, Catherine is drawn to David's attractiveness. This leads to a romance she did not expect. When Catherine meets David, there is an instant spark between them that makes them really want to be together. As their feelings for each other increase, Catherine is swept up in a maelstrom of want and passion. Join me as we discuss Catherine's romance with David. If they fall in love, will she be able to keep it a secret, or will their energy produce a scandal? This will be a unique story about love, treachery, and seduction. Every day, it started with the beginning of the year. David arrived for an interview for the gardener position on a Monday since our housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor, instructed him to. After showing him around the property, my husband interrogated him for a few minutes. They agreed to give David a trial period to see if he could work in the manner that the property required. Most of our employees had been with us for years, and many of them were already like family, so we rarely replaced them. However, things worked out so that we needed one additional employee who could work day and night if necessary. That's when I learned about David. He was mysterious and hard-working, but he didn't appear to care about what my husband desired. When I first saw him, he was lying on his back in front of the kitchen stove, piling logs. He appeared to be quite concentrated on his work. My spouse and I hadn't discussed the new pot yet. I had no idea what it would look like until I saw it. I only knew his name as David. As I approached the worker, I said, "Hello." He immediately turned around to wipe his trousers by passing his hands through them. "Hello, I believe your name is Mrs. Catherine." "Okay," he asked for a moment, and I didn't know what to say. I could see our gardener in my imagination, Mr. Henry, an elderly guy who was overweight and struggled to balance on the stairs. He was a kind and honest person. However, he was no longer old enough to handle heavy garden work. But in front of me was a large brown man with dark hair and skin. In contrast to Mr. Augustus David's interpretation of what youth entails. I assumed he was between 25 and 30 years old, and later confirmed, and it was correct. David was just 28 years old, but he'd been farming since he was 12. "My name is Catherine, and you must be David." I grinned back at them. I disobeyed one of my husband's restrictions because I was so fascinated at the moment. We did not talk to the workers during our time living on this massive farm after we married. I broke some old patterns and was brave enough to ask him to tell me who he was because I wanted to know him further. "What are your thoughts about the house? Have you already looked at the garden?" I inquired, taking an apple from the table stand. David remained stationary. He appeared to be at a loss for what to do next, either before I entered the kitchen or after answering my inquiries. He selected the second choice. It was really large. Despite my boss's instructions to work largely in the garden, Mr. Augustus walked me around it first thing in the morning. I believe it was made by Mr. Henry. He explained that you could tell he was humble and nice. "Augustus has stayed here longer than I have, and the garden is what he does best," I said. I told her, "I'm sure you'll do well after eating and swallowing the apple. You have what it takes to excel at all you undertake." David merely smiled, but I could tell what I said made him feel horrible. I promise I didn't mean to say that at the time, but David may have picked up on what my body was saying. We didn't talk for very long, but it was intriguing to discover a little about the person behind the gruff man character. David always put on. He hailed from an impoverished household, and as the oldest of 5 brothers, he began helping his father work as a carpenter. He didn't mention how old he was when he started working, but we're guessing about the time he took his first steps into the real world, when he was a child. When he grimaced, he left little but noticeable lines on his forehead. The way he spoke, and the way the veins in his arms popped out all indicated that he worked hard. Because of what happened to him, he is now a powerful, self-assured man with a puma-like mentality. Now that I look back, I realize I wanted him the instant our eyes met. But at the time, I was struggling with my marriage, and my husband's relatives were urging me to have a kid. Because of my fury, I couldn't look beyond my own little world, at least not far enough to realize that my body had always desired David. My hubby eventually came to admire David's art. David wasn't particularly pleasant, but the way he worked and moved around the house gave the impression that he was confident in his abilities. When I discovered David's talent for woodworking, I was impressed, as were the staff and my husband. Alexander, my spouse, soon gave him other tasks to complete. I didn't anticipate David's image to begin to merge in with every area in the house, as if he were always needed, whether to fix a door or get rid of a pest that was ruining the garden produce. Or even assist the cook in carrying the flour sacks when I went outside to drink coffee in the morning. Later I discovered that if I snuck into the backyard after dark, David might be shirtless and sweaty after working all day. That marked the conclusion of the trial period, and David was hired full-time to welcome him. Alexander instructed Mrs. Eleanor to prepare food so that they could celebrate with hot food and alcohol, which, improved the mood. The gathering was held in the kitchen on the first floor. It was a well-known location, yet all the employees laughing and chatting made me feel imprisoned. He continued going on about how vital the job was and how pleased he was to have David on the property. He poured himself a shot of tequila and raised his glass, but not before David offered a few words of welcome. "David, I hope you'll consider this property your home from now on," Alexander told David, putting his arm around his shoulders to demonstrate his understanding. "Son, you'll always be welcome here. Let us toast with glasses in hand." We all made a toast to Alexander's happiness. However, David did not appear to feel the same way for some reason. He hurriedly drew away from the focus. At the time, it appeared that Augustus was the only person he felt secure around. They spent the remainder of the night together. I am not going to lie. Being sane had left my mind by that moment. Desire rose with each contact, regardless of how essential or meaningful it was. From a distance, it appeared like he was bragging whenever I saw him at work or roaming about the property. That's what I thought up until that morning. The crowing of the roosters awakened me up. The sun hadn't risen yet, but I could hear people conversing and traveling back and forth. David was one of them. At that time, the sound of his speech caused my body to react. The entire day had been extremely calm. After a few phone calls at work, I walked to the dining room to eat with Alexander's group. When we were finished, we always kissed goodbye, symbolizing everything that had died between us. Then I returned to work, where I spent the next few hours completing my typical responsibilities. I looked forward to the end of the afternoon, when I could remove the mask I had created over the years as the sun set. I turned off the computer and dashed to my room's terrace. David arrived every day at the same hour. His boots were soiled, and his button-down shirt was soaked in sweat. Even though he was in awful shape, he remained appealing. There was something in the way. It was the way he moved with his shirt rolled up to his elbows, or the sweat that ran down his cheeks. That day, there was something odd about him that kept you from looking away. It affected everything and caused things to spiral out of control. I observed David hide in one of the trees through the window, where I was obscured by the curtain's edges. Before removing the final button, I noticed him removing his shirt. David took a moment to ensure that no one was nearby. That was how he completed removing all of his clothing. I can't describe how I felt when I saw him with his guard down, surprised that he had removed his clothing to take a quick bath in one of them. The astonishment of her bravery quickly faded. David was surprised at how much better the front aspect of his body appeared than he had expected. David's virility demonstrated that some individuals could make life worthwhile, and they lavished him with everything a woman could desire. Of course, I was no exception. Feeling terrified, I stepped away from the window and raced for hours to my room. As the hours passed, I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling. I had trouble figuring out why I was so upset. She wasn't sure if it was because she had seen him naked, or because she desired him much more than before. When I thought about Alexander, I remembered the young guy he had been. And no matter how hard I tried to emulate David's youthful appearance, and the emotions he evoked in me at the time, nothing seemed but to match what I saw in him. There was a significant difference between them, and my body shouted to discover whether David's charm was as strong elsewhere. However, being alone did not take my mind off Alexander's leaving. That night, they moved and grew stronger. To get a particular version of Jose Cuau, I waited until the workers went to sleep in their rooms before breaking into the bar with a bottle in hand. I left the house and walked for a bit till my feet hurt. It was dark, and I was intoxicated, so it took me longer to glance around and figure out where I was. Someone saw me leave the house and followed me, which was fortunate because I did not get lost that night. "My name is Sarah. Are you okay with that?" I didn't comprehend who I was talking to. I was still staring up at the sky, and the weight of the bottle on my wrist was all that kept me from going insane. David was present when I looked. My intellect didn't move as quickly as my body. I kissed him right away. However, David left me soon away, so our first meeting was brief. What did you expect from me if you didn't make me feel terrified or ashamed? So, when I responded, it wasn't the quiet and subservient Catherine who constantly relies on Ed or someone else to speak for her, it was the woman raging with want. "David, I want you. I can't handle it any longer, I've been doing it for so long." He kept his distance from us, so I whispered to go close. He didn't respond. I dropped the bottle. I didn't worry about the sound of the liquid spreading over the ground. I then placed my hands on his wrists and gently squeezed them. "If you both want it, this is the time." David simply stood there and gazed at me for a bit. My heart continued to beat for those few seconds after that. When our lips touched for the second time, it felt like time had stopped and nothing mattered. I knew David sleeping on the grass would not worry me. David and I let go of the clothes, titles, and thoughts that were preventing us from experiencing and discovering pure pleasure. The stars were the only ones who witnessed our meeting. We give ourselves without thinking about or favoring anyone else. When I was in the garden with my gardener, it was simply our bodies expressing what we desired. I knew that some loves came into our life to destroy things we couldn't bear for a long time. We were there together. Something kept us from breaking up. And as I gave way to my pleasure, David offered me more of himself, his body, spirit, and strength. He could do it all at once, resurrect things in your life that you thought were dead, and transform you into a woman who is loved and desired once more. What happened next? I can't recall. Do we kiss farewell, as Alexander and I did every time we parted ways? Was it acknowledged that it was a mistake caused by drinking and suppressed desire? The next morning, I had no idea. The events on the lawn were still vivid in my thoughts, and every time I breathed in and out, the friction of my garments on my skin reminded me of his hands probing in the hot morning sun, to the fire that his attention had ignited within me that morning. When I saw him in the kitchen, his expression informed me that what had happened wasn't because he was intoxicated, that he had no regrets or explanations, that he hadn't done what his boss had directed him to do, and that he hadn't felt obligated to make a lonely lady like me. Because he felt terrible for himself. His eyes revealed that he enjoyed what had happened and occasionally wished to do it again. One-time incidents leave imprints on you that you cannot explain. I knew that the mark David had left on my flesh would be difficult to remove. Now it is your time. Think I was able to keep it secret from my husband? I realized what I did was terrible, but you should sometimes believe your instincts. And this was my case. If you want to see more confessional videos like this, like the movie and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much, and see you next time.